Breastfeeding is hard. It may look like they're just sitting there, but it takes a ton of energy, both physically, mentally, emotionally. Breastfeeding mom will spend anywhere from 400 to 650 hours feeding or pumping just in the first 6 months. So that's anywhere from 20 to 40 hours a week. Ultimately, the bottom line is our job is neither to fully check out of breastfeeding, like, oh, that's her thing and she's just doing it, nor is it our job to micromanage it, and act like we know better in some way. So we want to protect the conditions that make it work, such as time, calm and comfort, the right information to give confidence, and then nourishment to her, and just whatever active good help support looks like. You are listening to Dedicated Joe, the new dad's guide on the upending and transformational experience of becoming a father.
We are dedicated.
Hey guys, today I want to talk about breastfeeding, how you can best support your breastfeeding partner, especially in those early stages when she's just learning how to do it. It's a very sensitive topic. A lot of women have a lot of shame. All women, I think, have a little bit, and some have a lot. And not all women can breastfeed, and it's a lot harder for some than others. And so there's a lot of complexity here. I'm going to try to give you the broad overview of how to approach it and what to do, but there's a ton more resources out there for you to learn about, especially if there's any specific issue you and your partner are having. So this is a really important topic for us. As nutrition experts, my wife and I understood the value of breastfeeding, and my wife was very committed to doing everything she could to breastfeed our daughter for really a long time. We didn't have a specific end date, but she wanted to do it for a long time. And it was really tough. Her latch was tough. We had a C-section baby, and C-section babies sometimes don't immediately latch as easily because they're, maybe weren't quite ready to come out, or there's just something different about it. So we had trouble with the latch. She had persistent pain. She struggled with supply. We ended up supplementing a lot with donor milk, but then unfortunately supplementing with anything else leads to even more reduced supply, and just this kind of struggle with it, ending up with Della weaning early. She weaned at 9 months, which was a lot earlier than we wanted, but she was just sort of tired of the effort of breastfeeding. So, that led us to have to find formula, which was, there was really no good formulas at that point, and ended up leading us to creating our own formula, which is the best formula in the world, but still, of course, isn't as good as breast milk. So it's been a very important topic, and made me really want to talk about how men can support it, because it's a team sport ultimately, right? Like dads, we can't physically do it, but there's a lot we can help with, and it's one of the best things we can do to help our baby is help them breastfeed. So team sport, mom plus baby, plus a whole support system, which includes you and anything you can do to help. Ultimately, the bottom line is, our job is neither to fully check out of breastfeeding, like, oh, that's her thing and she's just doing it, nor is it our job to micromanage it, and act like we know better in some way. So we want to protect the conditions that make it work, such as time, calm and comfort, the right information to give confidence, and then nourishment to her, and just whatever active good help support looks like. So first of all, crash course on breastfeeding. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining why breastfeeding is important. There's a ton of data, undisputed data that you can easily find. So we're going to start from the assumption that your wife already knows this and wants to breastfeed and is physically able to breastfeed. Now, 95% of moms are physically capable of producing enough milk to exclusively breastfeed through the 6 months until you start adding solids. But despite that, only 27% of Americans actually exclusively breastfeed through 6 months. So this is a pretty sad statistic, in my opinion. And the fact is, it's not because they can't do it physically, other than that 5%. It's not because they're lazy and they just give up, right? It's because they don't have the right information, the right support, the right social conditions to do this really, really hard job, right? So we would never have made it to 6 months without donor milk, for instance, even though we were trying to do everything right. And Della quit entirely at 9 months. So, really because she wasn't getting enough. And so it's just, there's some lessons I learned through that process that I really want to share here. Core principles. Breastfeeding is hard. It may look like they're just sitting there, but it takes a ton of energy, both physically, mentally, emotionally. A breastfeeding mom will spend anywhere from 400 to 650 hours feeding or pumping just in the first 6 months. So that's anywhere from 20 to 40 hours a week, depending on the age of the baby and how much they're eating. So your attention and support really, really matters because it's so hard. Plus, it is a skill to be learned. It is not something as natural as it seems like it would be, like, oh, they just come out and they just start breastfeeding. Like, both baby and mom have to learn this skill. And so we'll talk more about how you can support in them learning that skill. Another principle is supply follows demand. So the more milk removed from the breast effectively, the more the body will make. So the best way to get your baby this critical nourishment is to make it as easy as possible for mom to breastfeed as often and for as long as possible. Like I said, because we supplemented with donor milk, that actually reduced my wife's supply and created that slippery slope that eventually ended in formula. This can happen if moms start adding in formula or any supplementation at all, because the supply goes down if there's not that constant demand on the breast. So big drivers of success: effective latch and milk transfer, right? This is really critical, and this is you almost always, I think, need a lactation consultant for this to really ensure that the latch is absolutely as good as it can be. If a mom has the intuition that it's good and she knows what it looks like, fine. I just always say, like, when in doubt, hire a lactation consultant to come and confirm, yes, you're doing that exactly right. Frequent feeding, especially when they're really little, like, or cluster feeding, they're just going to feed that first few weeks. They're just going to feed all day long. Just a constant feed. And then even for the first 6 months, they're going to want to feed like many, many times a day. The social conditions are critical: space, time to feed, a sense of privacy, or a restful spot to do it, and then adequate nutrition and hydration, right? It takes a lot of water out of the body and a lot of nutrients, so they need to eat a lot and they need to drink a lot of water with electrolytes. The mom is that is. So what normal looks like, right? First of all, cluster feeding, super normal, especially in the early weeks where the baby just feeds multiple times within a short period. So they might feed a little, stop, feed a little, stop. It may take hours, so it's kind of rough on the mom, but that is normal for babies to just feed and stop and feed and stop and feed and stop. Diaper output, weight trends, and a baby's overall behavior are the most important thing to measure rather than comparing ounces. So if you have any doubt in supply, which basically every breastfeeding mom at some point doubts their supply, like, am I producing enough? I don't know. Very, very normal. It's important to really say, well, are they growing? Do they have regular diapers? Does our health experts have any issues with their weight gain or with their behavior? If not, then it really doesn't matter how much it is. It's enough. So that's really what you want to look at. And also pump output. It's a lot easier to measure pump output than it is to measure just feeding output, because you can't always see how much is going in. And it's not the same. Babies can actually get more from the breast than pumps can. So just even if the pump output is lower than you'd like, the baby still might be getting plenty. Okay, red flags to watch for. Here are the things to watch for that are not normal or shouldn't be normal and are cause for action. Number one is pain of any kind. Cracked or bleeding nipples, any pain that continues in the feed. It should just never, ever hurt. So this is not normal. It should not hurt. Clicking or slipping off, or like a shallow latch, especially after that first, week or 2 weeks when they've really gotten the hang of it. If they're still slipping off a lot, or the shallow latch isn't that great, or just this frustration at the breast, like baby just seems frustrated, like it can't get on or it can't get the milk at once, he or she wants, that's not normal. Very long feeds with little relief. So like they're feeding for a really long time, but then they still seem hungry immediately after, or they're just like kind of fussy as if they're hungry. You have the intuition they're hungry even though they've fed a lot. If your health provider flags anything about your diaper output or weight gain, those are both things your health provider will be checking. And if they say, oh, it seems like they're not putting out enough diaper output, or like they're not growing fast enough, that's something to think about. And then if just for mom has any kind of sense of dread of feeding, right? Like it hurts, or it's stressful, or she just doesn't, she's just like avoiding it or dreading it, like that's definitely an issue. All these things are all addressable. They're all fixable via a lactation consultant. Right. So this is, I'm going to say again and again that the lactation consultant professionals are your absolute best friend in these scenarios. And I just think people should hire him just right out the gate, like just included in your postpartum plan to like get with a lactation consultant ASAP. Because like I said, it's a skill to be learned. If you're learning a new skill, best to have a coach, someone to teach you the skill. And great if other moms or breastfed are around and help you, that's great. And every mom gets to decide this, it's up to you to just to hire one or not. But I just think it's just a really good idea. And then if there's any of those red flags, bring them back, right? And sometimes there's even some cities have centers where you can go in and there's like groups, or there's this really cool organization called La Leche League where you can go to group classes that are also a lot more affordable and a great place for moms to bond with other breastfeeding moms and other women and build community there. So check out La Leche League, Google lactation consultant in your city, and you'll find a list of them for any of those red flags, especially any kind of pain, right? It just should never, ever hurt. So a good script for you, a good quote is, hey, pain is a signal. Let's get some help, right? We don't need to just tough it out. Let's get some help in here and we'll figure out how to make this not hurt. At the very least, I feel like lactation consultant is a really critical step before switching to formula. Before if you're going in that direction of like, it's just not working, I think we need formula, get a lactation consultant in there ASAP because, not like I said, 95% of women can get it if they have the right skill and conditions. So you may not need formula. It's a lot better if you can avoid it. So dad's role, right? Obviously, lactation consultant, we can research them, we can find them, we can hire them, we can take notes of what they say and help remind our partner of that later. Mommy brain is real, so she might not remember, especially if she's actually breastfeeding while the person's there. It's hard to take notes. So we can really be a big part of that. We can run interference, right? We can be the gatekeeper, visitors, texts, chores, older kids, stressful information from the world, whether it's news or stuff at work you find out about or stuff in your family life. Like, don't chit chat with them about stressful stuff, especially while they're breastfeeding. If you have older children, right, you can protect, handle them, pets, deliveries, noise, just anything that's going to create a stress response is going to mess with that, with the breastfeeding. Be the gatekeeper, run interference, and then protect those sleep windows, the skin to skin feed time and napping during the day, sleeping as much as you can at night, but especially during the day. Napping is huge because they, especially in the early weeks, are still on that cycle where they're awake at night and sleep during the day because that's what they did in the womb. And so for a while it takes to change that. So napping during the day is key. So you can really play a role in making sure she gets to nap. Now you can also create the breastfeeding station. At least one. Some people have two. If you have one upstairs and one downstairs. Here's your what I would say is included in your breastfeeding station. First of all, a big water bottle with electrolytes. We really like LMNT. We feel like that's the best electrolyte on the market. Has the most sodium and electrolytes in it and tastes pretty good. We know the owner and trust them. So Element electrolytes, you refill it. Just keep it full all the time. One-hand snacks, things that they don't need like a knife and fork to eat with. So, with especially protein, and a lot of moms crave more carbs. So nuts, cheese sticks, jerky, yogurt pouches, granola bars. We love our IQ bars. I'll put a link to those in the chat because they're super nutrient dense, and as well as meat sticks like Chomp Sticks, or we have a new brand we love called Singing Pastures, 2 great meat stick options. Then burp cloths, towels, and an extra shirt. So she might get things on her, milk on her shirt and want to change without leaving. So have like extra spare nursing shirt for her, burp cloths, towels, support pillows. You're just a weird position. So lumbar support for her back, regular pillows just for her arms. They make these really cool C-shaped breastfeeding pillows that I recommend having a couple of around the house that are really nice because they sit around here and they hold the baby and they hold her arm real easily. Phone charger, headphones, if she wants to watch a movie or get on a call or check social media or something and listen, and a charging cable. A nursing pads, or these are those little pads that help protect the breasts or are soft on the breasts. Also nipple balm or lanolin if she likes that. Not all moms will love that, but sometimes they use a little lanolin to help keep it moist. There's a milk catcher or a haka, Haaka. It basically, you put it on the other breast while you're feeding on one, because some milk will come out and it's both messy and you just don't want to lose it. So like you could put this little extra thing on one breast called a haka. It's a really, really cool tool. And then you can use that and put that in a bottle or save it for later if you want. For breastfeeding at night, you want a red light or amber light. We really love salt lamps, right? You don't want that blue light waking her and baby up for the night feeds if they get out of bed to do those. So like a little salt lamp or red light, a little trash bin with wipes. So wipes for, little messes or anything, or just hands after a snack or whatever, and a little trash bin to put those wipes in. And then just her favorite books, magazines, anything else, your wife likes, just keeping this, restocking this, just constantly checking, adding in more snacks, adding in more water. She'll really feel the love from you when she looks and the snacks have been refilled or her water's been refilled. It'll make her feel so good. And also, like, it's practically very useful. Otherwise, you can just handle everything that isn't chest feeding, right? If it's not feeding, you can do it. Diapers, swaddles, burping, soothing, like baby wearing, just strapping her on you and carrying him or her around, bathing if you choose to do that, pump hand maintenance, like washing the pump parts. If she's pumping, I very much recommend ordering a spare set of pump parts. So you have 2 sets, one you can put in the dishwasher, and one that's always clean, or even 3 if you want, just so you always have extra parts and handle that for her. You can track feeds, diapers, if that helps. You don't want to micromanage her, but if she would like to be tracking how many diapers or how often there's feeding for her own information or for your health practitioner, you could do that. You can be the one documenting. Then, like I said, the lactation consultant, you can schedule them. You can also research questions. You can talk with a health provider about questions you have, right? You can just be the information guy. Now, a little more on pumping. Not every mom decides to pump, but it can be a great way for her to allow others to feed her baby breast milk, you or family members or caregivers or whoever. So it's also great to relieve the pressure on her breast and to keep her supply going if she's away from baby for a period of time, like if she's going back to work or if she's traveling or for whatever reason. And so, pretty early on, my wife and I started taking turns at night. I would take the baby in another room from her all night long, and she would get up and pump once, and I would feed her a bottle. And so that really allowed her to get a lot better, more uninterrupted sleep and pump whenever she wanted, rather than it be on the baby's schedule. And then I could handle everything else about the baby if she was fussy or needing a diaper change or whatever. So Serenity pumped quite a bit for that. She also went back to work. She did some travel. So she would pump, she would travel with the pump, she would pump in the car. She pumped all the time. Now, which pump you get really, really matters. My wife wishes we had rented a hospital grade breast pump on day 1, because it can really boost supply really fast. Those pumps are powerful and work way better than the standard commercial, and they're not very expensive, like less than $100 a month to rent one of these. So you can Google that and find that, or if you have a hospital birth, you can ask them there how to find one. And so the very beginning, especially C-section babies, the milk doesn't come in as fast because of the C-section. She didn't go through the regular labor process often, and so getting that pump going helps stimulate it, and it just is going to produce a ton more milk and make it faster and easier for her to pump. They're too big to travel with, though. So you would use that. She'd use that at home, get a different one for travel. I could recommend one, but there are probably even better ones now. So you can just you do your own research or AI or whatever to find the best pump. Now I want to talk about tongue ties and lip ties. This is something my wife is on a mission to educate everybody about. These are malformations of the mouth that most people have. A lip tie is like a little tie in here on the bottom or top, and the tongue tie is this flap of skin that prevents the tongue from going all the way up. And a little bit of tie there is normal, but a lot of people have excess tie there. And these are malformations. They're not natural. They shouldn't be there. My wife's theory is that they happen from malnourishment in utero, not because a mom didn't try to eat well, but because our food is actually just less nutritious than it was 100 years ago. So there's these malformations of the face, and they really interfere with breastfeeding. Like they can really, really interfere with a good latch. And so now there's this standard practice of called revising them, which means lasering them off. They literally cut them with a laser. And it seems kind of radical to do. Our midwife recommended we wait 6 weeks to do Dellas, and we really regret that. We wish that we had done it right at birth, because it would have made that early breastfeeding, would have established the right habits early on, and not set up breastfeeding to be this hard thing that Serenity and Della had to do. And so there's other countries in the world where they revise them right at birth, and then they have higher breastfeeding rates. So really recommend checking if they have one, both lips and the tongue, and considering having it revised. You'd want to find an ENT, a pediatric dentist, or even some general practitioners will do it. So you just kind of have to ask around. Like, chances are good that someone in your city or nearby will have it revised for you. And we just say, for good breastfeeding, have that revised. It actually helps with other stuff later in life. Serenity and I both had ours revised in life. I had a lip and a tongue revised. And it, helps with breathing, and it helps with posture and all kinds of things that these ties can actually worsen. And it's good to consider having them revised. So we're big fans of that. The script for this is, let's assess the function and make a decision based on what's actually happening, right? It's a good line you can use. Okay, there's some certain things that you should not say or do, right? So I'm going to tell you what to not do and what to do instead. So first of all, shame, guilt, doubt, fear, all very normal mom things. When moms have a baby, their fear center gets bigger in their brain. So does their intuition center. So they're more magical, more afraid. But breastfeeding is a new skill, and it's very important. And so there's always doubt. Moms just doubt themselves. And so we just want to do anything to avoid encouraging that anyway. So just remember that could be her default state, and be cautious of that. First of all, you never want to minimize how hard it is, right? In any way, just be cautious not to imply that it's easy or should be easy, or that they're just sort of sitting there, right? It's very, very hard work. Never question if they're making enough milk. They were already questioning this, so don't encourage that. Almost every baby can get all the nutrition they need from breast milk. So don't encourage the doubt that your baby's not getting enough. Never suggest switching or adding formula, right? This is a decision the mom will have to make if she chooses to do it. But you don't want to be a part of that. If it's not great. We'll talk about formula in a minute, but also it just makes her feel bad. What? I'm not doing right. I'm not doing enough. You think we need to use formula? And never compare her feeding or production to another mom. Oh, such and such said she's getting so many ounces a day. How come you're not getting that? Or anything like that, right? Just never ever compare. Moms compare themselves to other moms all day long. So you don't need to do it. And an interesting one is it's good not to even jokingly talk about how you miss her boobs being for you. You may think that I'd never say that. What are you talking about? And I thought that too. And I did have that thought that there was some sadness or whatever at the loss of her boobs, and her sharing them or whatever. And so, she's already maybe self-conscious about that. So just don't even bring that up. Just don't talk about that. The sexual relationship comes back very, very soon. And so, you'll get them back soon. Things you can say, you're doing something really hard. I'm with you. That looks really tough. I'm here with you. I'm here no matter what. Right. You can ask her, what do you need to feel supportive right now? What would you like? Especially if she's seeming stressed out, rather than try to fix it with a lot of suggestions, just ask her, what would help? You can make suggestions if you want, do you want some quiet time? Do you want a snack? Do you need some more water? Do you need me to help you get comfortable? Do you want me to just hang out with you? Right? That's one of the easiest things. Just hang out with her. Right? Just be there with her. Gets kind of boring and lonely. So you could just go and just be with her while she's feeding. And then if there's any challenges, you can say let's try to solve the cause, not just patch the problem. What can I do? How can I help solve it in a gentle and supportive way? Now, the last thing I want to talk about are the myths around low supply and why it's best to try to avoid formula unless absolutely necessary. So here are the facts. 99% of babies are able to get all the nutrients they need for the first 6 months from breast milk. Very, very rare that a baby has a condition that does not allow them to get everything they need from breast milk. The World Health Organization recommends exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, and then continued supplementation basically for as long as the mom wants, through 12 months is pretty standard to continue supplementing solid foods with breast milk. But breastfeeding is super hard, right? We said 95% of women can do it, but 27% of America don't do it. The highest rates in the world are in some Africa countries where they have 88+% of moms breastfeeding. So it can be done, but it's very, very tough to do. So you never want to judge or shame anyone who chooses to use formula. I'm certainly not meaning to do that here. That is, what moms need to do in this society. It's very, very tough. There's a lot of challenges. Even if you try to do everything right, you still may end up with formula. So like I said, we did it 9 months, had to go to formula. So it's like, as much as I want to talk about the facts here, the fact is that a lot of moms do choose to use formula, so don't want to shame them. So my goal is not to demonize formula. We make a formula. We sell a lot of that formula. We believe in that formula. We believe in its health for your baby. But I do want to give you the information you need so that you can really make an informed decision and really avoid the myths and the accidental slippery slope into formula use. So, common myths. Fussy baby means low supply. Often not true. Babies fuss for lots and lots of different reasons. Small pump output means low supply. It's not a direct measure, right? Babies can suck more than the pump. Soft breasts mean no milk. Not true. Breasts can just become soft normally. It's just a normal regulation for them to be soft or hard or different textures. Every mom I have met has doubted their supply at some point. So just because a mom doubts it and has a concern about it doesn't mean that it actually is a problem, right? Doubting is normal. Fear is normal. Asking those questions is normal. So those are myths. Now, one thing that I see a lot of parents do is like, oh, maybe we'll just top off. Okay, I think they're breastfeeding good, but I just want to make sure they're getting enough. So we're going to top off with formula. We're just going to add a little bit of extra formula so they just get like one feeding a day of formula. Now, the risk here is formula is easier for babies to eat because it's from the bottle and it can flow fast. It can be tempting for some families to want to top off with formula, right? Even if breastfeeding is good, or maybe they have a little bit of doubt on the supply, they think, oh, I want to get my baby just a little bit extra nourishment. So we'll do like one bottle of formula a day in addition to the breast milk. What can the harm be? So here's the harm: is the biggest risk is that it reduces supply. It's actually easier for babies to consume formula from a bottle because it's just faster and easier to higher flow oftentimes than the breast. So it sort of like trains them that they'd rather bottle feed because they just want to get fed quickest is their instinct. But it's not nearly as nutritious as breast milk. And then supply follows demand. So if the baby's not as hungry because they drank formula, now they're not wanting to breastfeed as much, then they want more formula, and then the supply goes down, and now you need to use more formula, and then the supply goes even further, and then they're suddenly weaned and it's dried up and you're now on exclusive formula. So it's a real slippery slope. So I just recommend to absolutely avoid it if you can. Use lactation consultants and try to breastfeed and really just trust that this is a natural process. Baby is going to get enough, and that your baby can and a mom can if you choose to with the right support. Now, if supplementation is medically needed, right? It can be strategically paired with a plan to protect your supply. So if a lactation consultant, for instance, says, okay, you're one of those rare cases where I think a little bit of formula is needed, or donor milk for that matter, you can get donor milk asking around or on the internet to use that. You can supplement with, and you just need to be prepared to protect the supply through strategic pumping or other things like that to make sure that it doesn't dry up too quickly. But again, formula can be necessary. It can be medically necessary. It can be just socially necessary for some women. So no shame there. The key here is just not defaulting to formula, at least in that first 6 months, in order to fix lacks or transfer problems, right? Get skilled help quickly. If you do need formula, I'll put a link to our formula and a discount code. Use discount code dedicated15. Get 15% off that formula if you really need it. It's the best one in the world. We made it to mimic breast milk more closely than any formula in the world. So Serenity Kids formula is by far the best, hands down. So if you need it, that's the one. Otherwise, your job: protect mom's energy and confidence in her breastfeeding, help her stay fed and hydrated, remove obstacles, and get expert help as soon as you can if something feels off. And otherwise, enjoy that time with baby. And, it's a very magical, special time. The breastfeeding time doesn't last forever. So enjoy that. Please subscribe to the podcast. It really helps me reach more dads. Share this with a dad of a breastfeeding partner. And let me know in the comments how you've been able to help with breast milk. Other than that, stay dedicated.